Good morning. Good morning, everybody, and good morning to Tanya Crossman, who's joined me all the way from Australia, where it is 6:30 in the evening. So thank you so much, Tanya, for joining me so far away and taking time out. And I'm Helen Jennings, and I'm a coach. I coach people in managing stress, especially how to prevent having a burnout. And also I coach people when they're having to get out of a burnout, how to reinvent your life and build something, build your confidence and move forward. But today we're going to discuss one element of stress that perhaps a lot of people are just not aware of. That's why I've invited Tanya Crossman, because she has a certain amount of expertise in this area. So any employee could face stress in the workplace, especially when they start a new position or a new company and they move house. That's just recognized. But this is compounded when the staff member actually has to move to another country and a new culture. And sometimes it's their home country, so to speak, but they haven't lived there. But Tanya works to support people who've lived abroad for some time and they're faced with going back to their home country. Some of these people are actually young people who are moving back to live in their passport country, in parenthesis, for the first time. And their new employer may be quite unaware of the stress of this integration or the level of stress that this causes for them, thanks to their background. So Tanya, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, where do you come from and what you actually do?
Hi, thank you so much for having me today, Helen. As you said, I'm here in Australia, which is my passport country. Home is a trickier question. I grew up between Australia and the US, and when I was 21, I moved to China, and what was supposed to be 1 year of study became my home for most of my adult life. I met my husband there. He's American but grew up in China. And during the pandemic, I was on a business trip when China's border closed. So we ended up in our respective passport countries, him for the first time since he was 10 years old, and me here living in my parents' house in my 40s, which is what everybody dreams of while I wait for my immigration papers to join him over there. So that's a bit about my where. And Cambodia is my other second home that I've spent a lot of time in. My what is that we moved around as a child because of my dad's work with a multinational company, IBM. The internal abbreviation was I've been moved because there was a lot of mobility in that company. And then as an adult, I slowly became aware of language for that experience of moving around as a child and accidentally became an expert. So I have been now working with globally mobile families in a range of sectors and environments for 18 years. My first book came out in 2016. I have another one coming out this year. And I've spent a lot of that time in research, so better understanding what are these experiences like and how can we support these families better.
Mm. So you are what would call, if you want to categorize people, a TCK. Can you tell me exactly
Yes.
what that means for people who haven't a clue?
A TCK stands for a third culture kid. A third culture kid is someone who, during their developmental years, so before the age of 18, spends a significant amount of time outside their passport country with the expectation that they will leave, that they're not there permanently, they don't have legal status, they're not citizens, they're not permanent residents, they're on visas with the plan to go somewhere else, to go quote unquote home at some point. So the UN estimates there's around 50 million TCKs out there at any given time
That's a lot.
in the world right now, which is a lot of people, many of whom don't have terminology for that.
Mm.
And there can be a bit of misunderstandings about what this means. The third culture isn't, where I'm from plus where I'm living equals the third culture. It's a little bit more nuanced. The first culture is my legal culture. So which government says I belong. So I have citizenship, I have a passport, I have a green card, something like that. Second culture is geographic culture, and that's countries I've lived in, places I've personally experienced that culture and I've engaged with. And third culture is the shared experience of others who grew up like me in between. So
Mm.
about a third of the young people I've worked with had more than one legal culture.
Mm.
40% had 4 or more geographic cultures, so they've lived in 4 or more countries or cultures. 10% had 6 or more. So it's not about there's 3 countries. There can be 5, 6 countries involved in their upbringing. It's these 3 types of cultural experiences that make up the TCK lifestyle.
Right. And the minute you meet somebody who has had the experience, you have instant compatization. You understand each other right away because
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
things to
I
deal
remember running an event in Cambodia, and this kid comes running up to one of my friends who's also one of the leaders and said, "Oh, miss, you have to meet this guy. We have the same story." They didn't have any overlap in their legal or geographic cultures, but they had so many shared experiences in that third culture that he felt like they had the same story. Because for so many TCKs, your passport country and the country you live in are not your primary markers of what was my childhood experience. My childhood experience is more about being in between than it is about the specific place, because I will have more in common with this other person who lived like I did than I will with people who grew up in the country I grew up in, or people who grew up in the country my passport's from. And so there is this affinity between many third culture kids simply because their childhood home is an intangible experience that transcends physical space.
Yeah. So it raises issues of identity, doesn't it? Especially when you move to another country or you move back to your home country. So thank you very much for that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and your own experience with stress in your family because of this traveling sort of profile. So I'm Helen Jennings, as I said before. I'm also a TCK, but I grew up in Africa in a very dusty village. And I went to a boarding school at the age of 5 until 16. I managed to managed to attend 3 different boarding schools during that period. One of them was in Ivory Coast. So I spoke an African language up to the age of 12, and I learned French all the way through my academic life. So I'm now bilingual, and I've become French as a result of my experience and desiring to move somewhere else yet again with my own children. So I understand fully the stress of moving to another country when you're not really from that country, but you think you're supposed to be. So that was when I was 16 and I moved back to the UK for my studies, and it was a total shock. So this interview, as a result of all these combined experiences, is to focus on why it is so difficult for TCKs or third culture kids to adjust to working life in a new country or in their home country, and also adults who move back to their countries after living abroad for so long in other countries. How do they cope with moving back to their home country where they're expected to be a certain way, but they're not really, because they're so mixed up inside and they have this identity which is now blended identity. So we're going to talk about the young people and the adults. We're going to talk about your own company, what you work for, which is TCK Training, which helps people to prepare for this. And also we're going to talk about employers and what they need to be aware of when they're receiving or recruiting people from abroad, and how they can identify this profile to be able to help them really integrate into their company. Because as we know, the prevention of stress in all staff is highly important, and it's on the agenda right now, and it's becoming more on the agenda. So the highest factor in losing international staff, as I have read from many surveys, is that they have not adjusted to this new company or this new culture. A second element of that is their family have failed to adjust to the country because they followed them. So this is quite an important issue, dealing with stress, but also identity, and is very relevant to companies and their recruiting. So let's go firstly to talk about the employee and how can they develop a strategy for going back to their home country, which can also be called a re-entry. What do you think, Tanya?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with groups of people who are planning these repatriation moves. My own experience, I've now repatriated 3 times. Once as a teenager, once as an adult by choice, and once as an adult through unplanned circumstances with the pandemic. Each one was very different. But the biggest thing about repatriation is that in some ways it's just another international move. It has all of the same logistics and transition stresses that you would have moving outside your passport country. You have to work out the moving and the shipping and the time zone changes and adjusting to a new way of life you have to do all of those changes and the way that impacts your body and your brain. All of those transition stresses exist, and all of those logistics exist. And when you have done a lot of moving around, you think, well, I've got this down. I know what this looks like for me. I know how to do this. But when you're moving to your own passport country where you have that legal piece of paper, it actually is a very different kind of move, because the expectations are different. Now, this is both your own expectations and the expectations others have of you. What I found is that when I am the foreign person in an environment, there is a sense of, I can explain away and others can explain away when I don't understand, when I make mistakes, when I make cultural faux pas, when there's gaps in my knowledge, when I ask a question that seems a little bit odd. That can be understood because of my otherness, my foreignness. When I'm in my own country, and especially if I have a look or an accent that belongs, I have language that belongs, that grace for otherness disappears.
Yeah.
So I don't have grace for my own mistakes, and other people don't have grace for my own mistakes. One of the most, key examples of this for me was I wasn't even repatriating. I was just coming back on a visit, and I get off an overnight flight and I'm exhausted, and I just want to get some breakfast at the, takeaway in the airport before I get on a bus to my next destination. And I order and I go to pay, and my card, I can't find the place to put my card in the machine. And then she goes, okay, well, I'll put it in the bottom. And so I put it in and I take the card out, because that's how they used to work the last time I was in Australia. She's like, no, you have to leave it in there. So I put it back in, and I just felt so stupid. I couldn't even use my own bank card in my own country because the machines had changed since the last time I'd been there. And this person looking at me, seeing someone who looked and sounded like they belonged, had no grace for me and was just like annoyed at me for not being able to use a card. And that times 100 experiences over your first days, weeks, months in your country gets you feeling like there is something wrong with me.
Yeah. So when people
and every time you miss the country that you've come from and the environment you have, you feel like this is this betrayal of your as we say, your home country. That why I'm home, I should be happy, everyone's so excited, but I'm sad. It feels like a betrayal. It's not the same. It feels really different, emotionally different, logistically different.
You feel like you should belong, but then you realize, oh, you don't belong. And then you think, well, I didn't belong in the other country either. So where do I belong? And how do I?
So where's my place now?
Yeah. And what about my new job? How do I belong in the new job?
Yeah, everything keeps going. It's like you've have a river that's split in two, and you've gone one way and it's gone the other way. And when you come back together, it takes a while to kind of sync back up again, because things have changed for your family, your friends, and your environment, and your country as a whole. Your country's own culture can change. There's national discourse that takes place while you weren't there that you haven't maybe been part of. And you feel like the conversations people have, I don't really know how to engage with, because maybe my values have shifted slightly through influence where I used to be. And so there's a lot of little rubs, little things, and it feels hard to pinpoint what is stressing you out, because it's all these little things. There's not big glaring things a lot of the time.
Okay.
And it's going to be different depending on what place you've come from and what's different for you. Sometimes I'd get overwhelmed in the supermarket looking at all the options. I'm like, I know what brand of cheese I buy in Beijing. I don't know what brand to buy here.
Yeah.
Or trying, like, where do I buy fabric for curtains in this country? I know what to do in China. I know how to do it in a different language, but I can't do it in my own passport country. All these kind of things build up because our expectations of ourselves, not giving ourselves grace for being new in a new environment, can make it all just a little bit harder.
So self-compassion is one of the strategies, really.
It's incredibly important. Self-compassion, absolutely. And acknowledging that things have changed. I have changed. and this place and its people have changed. It's not what used to be, and I need to catch up with the new version, just as they need to catch up with the new version of me. And that catching up and resyncing takes time.
And it's not your fault.
It's nobody's fault. It's not their fault for not understanding. It's not my fault for being different. So lots and lots of listening, right? Listening to people so I can catch up. What is normal here now? What do people talk about here? What are they interested in so that I can learn? Just like you would learn a new culture in a new country, we have to apply those exact same techniques to relearn our passport countries, not as we remember them, but as they are now.
Yeah. How about the difficulty with explaining who you are and not overwhelming other people with, oh, this is what my experience is?
Yeah. My favorite piece of advice is that you've got to give people only enough answers to match their curiosity. So if they have a thimble full of curiosity, don't give them a whole bucket full of answers, because you'll overwhelm them and you get that glazed over eyes look that most of us who have lived overseas know quite well. So be okay with giving short answers that maybe explain a little bit about who you are, and that people can always ask questions if they want to know more. Just give them a little taste of your story. What it's great to have prepared ahead of time is pre-planned answers to some of the common questions, like where are you from? Oh, what did you do there? Things like that. Have just short, sharp answers prepared. One way that I've heard it explained, which I think really helps, is you want a movie poster, a movie trailer, and then the full movie. So you want to have just a really short, sharp line that gives a simple picture of who you are, what your life is, where you've come from, that just gives people a little tease, but not the full story. And then the trailer, give them a little bit more information, but it's really just here's a little peek at what my story is. And when the people who still ask and still want to know more, then you can start getting into your real story. But it helps build in us this expectation that not everyone wants to know the full story. Not everyone can cope with the full story. And that's okay. It's okay to just give the movie poster version to some people.
That's a really good
and then some people will ask more about that, and some people will ask more from that. But matching your answer to the person's curiosity helps you feel less out of your depth, less of these confusing conversations. And pre-planning those answers definitely helps you not feel so put on the spot when that happens.
So how do you cope with people in your family, and you're going back and maybe visiting them? Maybe you don't live near them, but at some point you're expected to visit them. How do you deal with the stress of really feeling different from them now and still want to maintain that relationship?
Personally, I'm very blessed with family who've been very supportive of my journey. This is not the case for everybody. So many of my friends living overseas never had family or friends visit them where they lived, whereas I had family who visited me and who never put on the emotional blackmail for me living far away, which is an experience so many of those living overseas have had. There's a few strategies I've learned from friends who've been in this situation. The first is that you don't owe your whole self and your whole story to anybody, not even your family. And so it's okay to have deep relationships with some family members and shallow relationships with others.
That's powerful.
Because not everyone earns that part of your story.
Yes, yeah.
You can have relationships that are a little more one-sided, where you go and you are kind to them and you are civil with them and you keep that connection and you give them just movie poster answers about your life, and that's all they ever get because they never want more answers about it. And it's okay if that's all that happens with certain family members. As long as you have other people in your life, whether that's other family members or that's chosen family, those friends that you build around you who do know the real you, who do want the full story. Sometimes that won't be your blood family members. And one, it's okay that that's the case. And two, it's okay to be sad about that and to grieve that that is the reality for you. It's also okay if sometimes you need to take a break from that to be able to set those boundaries. But sometimes it's as simple as discerning the difference between willful ignorance and not wanting to know you, and just the ignorance of not being exposed to anything. The difference between a question that's the ignorance of just lack of exposure, where you can actually have a conversation and they can learn, or people who just do not want to learn anything about the rest of the world and who you are and the places that you've been. Because when people make ignorant comments without the intention to hurt and to harm, there can be space to teach. One of the most effective ways I've seen to do this is to give a literal taste, sharing food. Food is often a great way to start a conversation.
Yeah.
It might be treats. It might be, in my case, sometimes it was Chinese tea. It could be making food from a place that you've lived. Sharing something that is meaningful to you from a place that is meaningful to you almost always invites questions. And when people ask questions, then you can respond with more story. Maybe it's wearing earrings that have a bright pattern or that have some interest to them. People ask, oh, where do those earrings come from? And you can talk about the place that you got those earrings. Having little pieces in your life, little things that people will comment on because you've brought something of your story into their world. And then they give you a question that you can answer.
That's great. Yeah. How do you do about temptation to withdraw from the people who just don't understand you and to go and find your tribe, international tribe? In one sense, it gives a bit of relief that you might need when you're first in another country or in a new job. You look for the other people who've come from other countries, but there's also danger to that, isn't there? Becoming a little bit sort of alienated from sort of the people you
insular.
Normally, insulated.
Yeah. The first thing is that don't feel guilty about needing support. Everybody needs support. And when you are in that stage where you have like movie poster relationships with people, and the only people who really get you are the people who have these other international experiences, it's completely okay that you're getting support there. But yeah, like, as you said, the goal is that that's not your life forever. So I like to use an illustration of a gardening illustration. I have very green thumb grandparents and family in general. When you have, especially like a vine-like plant that's growing and it's young, you just put a stake in and give it something strong to grow against to help it as it's growing. It's kind of like scaffolding for a building. When you are in a new place, whether that's your home country or somewhere else, when you first arrive, you are starting from zero with everybody, and it takes a while to build those relationships. The people with whom you have the most affinity, those relationships are going to grow faster. And you're also going to have relationships with people who are still on the other side of the world. And so it's perfectly okay to be using those relationships as those stakes and as that scaffolding that will support you while you are building everything else, while those little tendrils of vines are growing and getting stronger, while the building is being constructed. And if you see those relationships as the supports that will enable you to build the life that you want and to grow a full plant, a full garden, they can be incredibly helpful as not a crutch, not a stepping stone, but as a supportive framework around which everything grows. If they are all you have, often your life can become a little empty because you're not engaging in the fullness of the environment and the community around you.
A little bit out of balance, I would
you
say.
survive, but you're less likely to thrive.
Yeah, that's so true. So it really, so the TCK coming back into a new country, their home country, it's important to allow themselves to be vulnerable, but also realize that there's ways that you can protect yourself as well from that grief, from that feeling of just total not belonging and being out of place. Those are very helpful strategies that you've given there.
Yeah.
How about
In my book, I run through a sort of 4 stages that in working with and talking to hundreds of TCKs, I found they went through all these same stages. And the first 2 are really about, first one is about feeling isolated and recognizing that that's normal and everyone feels that way at some point, especially in their passport country, and being like, these people are not like me and I don't know how to connect with them. That's really normal. Sometimes just normalizing and validating how we feel is all we need to do in that stage. And then we go into investing, like just choosing to, I'm going to choose some places and some groups to invest in. I'm going to show up and I'm going to be part of things. I'm going to get to know people. I'm going to give time to these people, these relationships, these activities, even though right now I'm not feeling like I'm getting much back. I'm just putting the investment in, trusting that it's going to grow in the future. And that's, that's why you need those stakes, those scaffolds of those established relationships and those easier relationships to support you while you're investing, while you're planting those seeds, before it all starts to grow. It's part of a process. And I think giving ourselves grace that it takes time, and that self-compassion and kindness, that I'm doing all the right things. And at some point in the future, this is going to feel better. Recognizing that a full transition takes 18 months to 2 years to complete. And often we don't give ourselves that much time. We jump into something new before that time's even come up. And so, yeah, just giving that space to ourselves
that wanting
can
to
make
go
a huge
fast,
difference.
wanting to go too fast is a phenomenon for children or young people who've moved into different countries, because they've got to settle in super quick because they know it's for 2 years and they've got to find friends really quick. So they sort of open up themselves completely to whoever is out there, and those people just not ready for it. So it's also
Yeah, that's really common.
and the other people function differently from you, and giving
And then
yourself,
every people are like, whoa.
yes. And then you suddenly don't have any friends at all.
Or the opposite, where they become incredibly good at small talk and being friendly, but never give their true selves.
That's true too. Yeah. Right. So brilliant.
Right? And there's two reactions to the same experience, that third culture experience, the shared experience of people leave. Whether you're the one who's constantly moving or you stay in one place and your friends are always coming and going, you learn to do relationships differently in that environment. And when you're living in an international environment where global mobility is common and everyone has these reactions to relationships, that makes sense. When you move out of that into a more, geographically stable community, such as in your home country, suddenly other people don't have those adaptations to relationships, and your way of relating doesn't jive with theirs.
Yes.
And the pace of relationships is very different.
Yeah.
The pace of relationships is different in different cultures anyway, but in international communities, the pacing tends to be very fast, as you mentioned, whereas it tends to be much slower. The less transient a community is, the slower the pace of relationships is. So maybe it takes a full year to really become friends with someone rather than a day or a week. And so for TCKs, that 2 months that it took to actually like have a conversation with someone about something more than the weather and what they watched on TV last night feels like forever. Whereas for their other person, it might feel like, oh my gosh, we're like fast friends so quickly. Just because that pacing of relationships is so different.
I definitely know what that feels like. So that's brilliant.
Yeah.
So if you are a TCK or an expat returning to another country for a new job, there is a lot of hope, because there are so many practical steps and awareness that you can build that will help you ease into this transition period, because it is a transition and it doesn't happen overnight. So it's so great. Thank you for those tips you've given, and I'm sure your book has a lot more in that. And we'll put the link at the bottom of the video for people to go further and really read up about it and to find out more about how they can deal with this stress. What about returning to an angle to consider how an employer would be affected by TCKs or expats coming into his company? He may be aware that they're coming from another country, but is he aware that they're culturally different or mixed? How does the employer How does the employer deal with it? If they have obligations, but how can the employer best identify these people so that they can help these people through their integration stage?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is when you have people who have engaged with multiple cultures, those perspectives that they bring can be really helpful if we can get past the hump of making sure that they integrate well. It's worth the effort, absolutely. So I guess the first thing is, no matter how progressive we think we are, we all have biases. We all have assumptions about other people. And this includes what their work style is, what they need from an employer, what they need from a work setting, how they communicate, their preferred work style, like how they want to have their work, delegated to them, and have their reviews given to them or their feedback presented. If they would prefer to work individually or in groups and within collaboration, like all of those kind of work style preferences. Often we tend to assume that people are the same as us, just on an individual work, sort of basis. And any of us who have worked in a workplace, in an office setting, have run into these issues where someone just works so differently than we do, and how we negotiate that. When you have someone coming in cross-culturally, and especially a TCK sort who their cross-cultural experience is not obvious on the outside, where they look or sound like they belong, but internally they've internalized, like in your case, you internalized African or French ways of thinking and doing that maybe didn't fit into a UK sort of setting. For myself, I've discovered over time from working in these Chinese workplaces, especially the ones where I was the only non-Chinese person in the building, some of the stuff that I've adapted to, that I come back and into more Western workplaces, and I'm like, oh, I've brought this into this setting.
Yeah.
But you don't look at me and think Chinese.
No, I wouldn't.
Right? You don't.
Yeah.
And so when you have someone in this situation, the employer is not going to look at them and think Chinese either. So even if you have an employer who is really cross-culturally aware, it's really possible for them to completely miss that there is a cross-cultural person standing in front of them when they're a TCK. So just beginning with the understanding of an international reality, that you can have a certain passport but think a different way.
Yeah, sure.
And that can go multiple ways. Like you can have someone who comes from a passport country that is very individualistic but thinks in a very collectivist way, for example.
Yeah.
And that they may have some early adjustment issues where their miscommunications are more cultural rather than character in nature. So giving TCKs some clarity on what the expectations are from the outset is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Because what might seem obvious to you in your workplace setting may not seem obvious to them if they haven't been schooled in this country. There may be unspoken, hidden expectations that's just normal for everybody. So spelling things out, the same way that we talk to teachers about teaching in cross-cultural settings, teaching children from a range of cultural backgrounds, being clear about what their expectations are, how we show respect in this classroom, what we expect you to do for homework, things like that. Be very clear about it. The same thing when you are onboarding a new staff member who has a TCK background, being very clear about expectations at the beginning will just smooth over some of those potential humps moving forward. By not assuming that they know those basic answers.
The communication is hyper important, not just explaining how the team is set up or the objectives of the company or the team, but communication, showing curiosity. It goes the same for any new member of staff, I presume. You just create a a sphere where it's safe to ask questions and to go further and say, okay, why do you do it like that? Okay, just I need to explain, just I need to understand, and giving the employer
Yeah.
also the chance to understand what the new person has to offer to the company. So,
Yeah. And it may be you may need to go as simple as, in this workplace, there is no such thing as a dumb question. We encourage you to ask questions about everything because maybe they come from a background where asking questions was considered really rude. That's
yeah,
that's how some education systems are set up. If
yeah.
that's the education system that they were raised in, then they may find it quite overwhelming to ask a question of a supervisor and in a work position. They may be like, they feel like I need to just find it out on my own, or I need, like, they will tell me all the things I need to know.
Yeah.
So just being clear about the expectations about what you expect them to do, how you expect them to solve problems. And the other one is to understand that they may have acquired skills in a very different sort of order, right? So their knowledge base may look very different. What happens with a lot of TCKs is that their skill set is constructed differently than might have been the case if they had simply gone through K through 12 in one school setting in one country. They will have adapted some extra skills that in your mind you're like, oh, that's an advanced communication skill, therefore they'll have all of the basic communication skills as well. So you see this advanced skill in place and you expect they have everything else. But because TCKs often acquire skills in a non-linear fashion according to your cultural setup, they may not have all of the things in place. And so just because you see one advanced skill, you may be surprised when something else is missing. And so just being, especially in those first couple months when someone's adapting to the new position, not making those assumptions and just acknowledging those advanced skills that you see, but just always just double checking that if you are asking something of them, that they have everything that they need in order to do that task.
Yeah, and there's also a difference in understanding if someone is very free to take initiatives on their
Yes.
own, or whether it needs to be requested by the hierarchy. Do they prefer direct feedback, or is the hierarchy expecting them to give some response, but it never comes? So explaining
Yep.
what is possible
Absolutely.
and inviting things as well, so the person knows, oh, we work like this, and I'm free to be different here, or maybe I need to learn to be different.
In one of my positions, I was working in a textile trading company. It was owned by an American couple, and other than me, everybody else in the company was Chinese. I was kind of an HR manager, office manager, a bit of everything kind of position. Anything that needed English, I did, and it was a bit of everything. But one of the things I ended up doing was I spent a lot of time explaining to some of the office staff who are managing certain departments how to communicate with the American boss without needing a go-between. So explaining these kind of things. So this is the way he wants feedback. This is, if you want him to do something, this is the way it needs to be communicated to him, because they would communicate. In one situation, one of the managers had something that needed immediate feedback from the boss. They texted a question, and he said, I'll be in, at this time. And so she waited until that time when he came in, and then she talked to him about it. And she really needed an answer like 4 hours earlier. And he could have given that answer 4 hours earlier if she'd given him the full story. But she didn't tell him the situation. She just said, like, I need to talk to you about something. And he said when he would be there, rather than, explaining the situation and what she needed and when she needed it. Because she's not used to managing a boss. That was not part of her cultural context.
Yeah.
And so training her and others in the team on how to manage their boss effectively. Like, this is the information you need to give so that you can get the response that you need. Because you ended up with this situation where they were both really frustrated. She was frustrated that he didn't take her need for his time seriously, and he didn't come into the office for another 4 hours. And he was frustrated that there was something that needed attention immediately and she didn't tell him about it. And so they were both frustrated. And so training people how to talk to each other became part of my job. And it's something I think we all need to learn, is how to talk to each other. But when you have one person who is culturally outside a company's norm, usually the work of bridging a cultural gap, bridging a difference, falls on that one person. And when that one person is someone who has just moved to a new country, has made this big transition, they're already in a place of incredible stress.
Mm.
So when the supervisor, the boss, the colleague who is established is the one who takes the initiative to bridge that divide, to learn how this new recruit thinks, it takes a huge amount of stress off that workplace relationship.
Yeah, it's a way of welcoming them into the company and helping them to fit in and understand how
Absolutely.
cogs meet together, how they work together. That's so great.
Yeah, and I think there is often this idea that the person who is different it's their duty to adjust to everybody else. But I really feel that goes against how so many of the countries that I have lived in that have this value on multiculturalism. If we say this and we believe this, that we are stronger together and working together, then that means that we need to do the work of bridging these gaps where they do exist. If I am more established and I am more comfortable in my position, then it takes much less work for me to bridge a gap, because I'm not under the stress of adjustment already.
Yeah.
And so I think when we see the value in cross-cultural teams in the workplace, when we see the value that this gives our companies, when we see the perspective it gives us and the ability to grow and to be more successful, then doing the work of getting to know how each other works is part of reaping the benefit of these cross-cultural teams.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's so important. Yeah. Wow. So would you say that the employer needs to have slightly lower expectations in the first month or so when they recruit someone new to allow that person to get up to speed?
I think it actually needs to be part of someone's work that's assigned to them in their first month, is simply tasks that enable them to get up to speed. Like the tasks that are assigned are these get up to speed tasks. For example, the job I just talked about, where I was sort of managing this office in a Chinese workplace, I went to my first staff meeting, which they're all conducted in Chinese. Overall, my Chinese was better than my boss's Chinese. My accent was certainly better. My overall vocab was better, but my specific vocab to the textile industry was abysmal, it turned out. I didn't realize how many vocab words I didn't have until I went into this staff meeting when I don't understand half of what's being talked about. So we created a task for me for that first month. Studying vocab 1 hour a day was part of my work for a whole month. And after that, it was an hour a week, was part of my work hours. I went through our invoices and our accounting forms and our product lists, and I made lists of all the vocab that we use in our workplace, and I made vocab lists and I studied them as part of my job. In another job that I was in, I had an intern, and everyone who was managing an intern, we had to create a project for their first week, which was create a project that is something that will use all of the different types of software that they need to be up to speed on, and engages with the people that they need to engage with, so that in their first week they are getting connected with everyone and everything that they will be using during their internship. So having tasks that are on their plate that are helping them do the work of learning and growing and doing all of this, I think can be done very deliberately to help people engage and connect. Because yes, the first month when you are in a new place, especially if you've moved physically to a new location, it's going to be really hard to adapt and learn everything. And so having a bit of grace for that is really important. But I think part of that grace is creating a workplace where our expectations for you in this time are to learn these things, not to be, top salesperson of the month. Like being clear about, this is what we want to do in this time. Giving people projects that are about getting them up to speed. gradually, helping us to learn you, helping you to learn us, acknowledging that that takes time and building that into the time that they're allotted for their work.
That's so positive. Yeah, I suppose that could also include social gatherings, social activities where new
Yes.
people are encouraged to
Yep.
get to know other people. It's not just a team building, but it's really about helping integrate new staff. It could be staff come from the same country even, but it helps the whole team to integrate.
Mm.
Mm. And how
Yeah,
about
it's
the
really great to get people together who are working in the team to tell them like what it was like for them to integrate into the team.
yeah,
What they found, what was the most useful advice that they can give you about, oh, here's a tip that it took me months to learn. Sometimes it's something like, here's the tip to how to make the copier work or to make the coffee machine work. Or it could be something about how to work with certain software or how to work as a team, or here's a great time to catch this person. Just those little things that takes you a while to acquire. Having, maybe it's a welcome coffee morning or something where you create an actual deliberate space to share that information. It makes people feel welcome in a tangible way, helps them adapt in a tangible way to the new work environment, and helps everyone feel connected and realize that you all have valuable things to share.
So it would almost work like a mentorship scheme, really, where you're encouraged to learn from people who already been through things in that company, and that those people can really help integration to happen so much faster.
Yep, definitely.
That's great. Yeah, so super. How about opportunities for sharing experience of the company? How can that be a real positive strategy for a recruiting officer, for example? How can that person?
I think, well, one of the things to keep in mind is if you are returning to a company that you used to work in, it's very different than if you're coming into a new company. And so the opportunities can be different. And sometimes when you have someone who's coming into a place for the first time, we are more we're more proactive about pointing out the benefits and the values. We're more proactive about talking about what we can learn here. And often when we're in that position as a new person, we are more open to what this place has for us to learn from. When you're in a returning position, I think we need to create a situation where those same things occur, right? Where we are giving that sense of created and perceived value, that we don't forget that that value is still there. Because so for example, when my dad would go on an assignment in one country and come back, often there's this sense that, oh, you've learned new skills and you've come back to the old place. Well, like we talked about before in terms of country and culture, it's not the old place because it's continued to grow and change. And so having this exchange of ideas, that we want to make sure that when we bring people back, that we give them that pump up as well of that. And here's what's been happening, and let's get you up to speed with everything that's been going on, and give them that sense of the place you're coming to is valuable and the people you're working with are valuable. We value you and we want you to value them. Making sure it's happening both ways, that we don't just go, oh, you worked here before, you're fine, and just dump them without giving that support that we would give a new person coming in, and that excitement we would give a new person coming in. Same as, when you are entering a country, like when you're doing these repatriation, these re-entry moves, it's both any other move and a completely different move. When you're a re-entering worker, it's a new job and and a very different kind of experience. It's both at the same time, and anything we can do to make that work, I think, is helpful.
Like the juggling balls up in the air for a while,
And
we've changed and other people have changed. Wow, that's super.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we recognize that this is a new job in some ways, this is a new position, and you are a new person coming in, if we have that attitude, then we can have much smoother transitions for everybody.
So what would be
so whether we're talking about returned workers or new workers, being able to let them know we value what you have. That's why we have you here. We value what you have to contribute to the team. And we want to make sure you know all of the positive things about this team and why. Like, we want to make sure you're excited to be part of this team. We want it to be both ways.
Yeah.
And that exchange and that balance should be true, whether it's a new worker or a returning worker.
That's great. So it becomes a positive learning experience all round for everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the next step to go from here? How can people go further if they need help with this? What resources are available?
Well, I think the first one is just acknowledging that this is a real thing. When I did my first repatriation, I was 15 years old. As I said, with my dad's company, with a corporate move, and there was no support for anything beyond the money to move, certainly outside of the workplace. And so we had no words for what we were going through. We had no language for it. And when you don't have language for something, it's really hard to describe it. I had someone reach out to me after reading my book. She was in the late 30s. She was a business person in Japan and went through a burnout. And after going through burnout, someone had made the connection and recommended my book, and she read it and she went, oh, there's language for all these things that I've been through. And so I think having these conversations, recognizing these experiences have vocabulary, is the first starting place to be like, you are not alone. These ways you are feeling are completely natural and normal. It is normal to feel completely discombobulated when you go through these big moves. In fact, when you go through a re-entry to a passport country, normal is to feel just completely all over the place 1 month for every year that you were gone.
Gosh, that's long.
So if you were gone for 2 years, you should expect to spend 2 months just really not sure which way's up. If you're gone for 6 years, that's 6 months. And starting with that starting point of going, okay, so what I'm going through right now is completely normal. It is normal to feel this way. Takes a huge weight off. When we talk about self-compassion, right, that sense that, okay, I'm doing fine. I'm not struggling. This is normal. And once we've got that, then we can start looking into resources. So you mentioned I work at TCK Training. I'm actually the Director of Research and International Education. So I work in a lot of creating research and stats and writing white papers around this data on the experiences of people who've grown up this way. And I work a lot with international schools and organizations and NGOs providing training and resources. One of the things that we have is a transitions course. It's a self-guided course where you can do it at your own pace. And we go through all of these things where you can just learn about the impact of transition and how to parent through transition. What about when it's an unplanned and you didn't actually plan to move? What about when it's re-entry like this? And talking through all of these things with some reflections and just short, 5 to 15 minute videos that you can do at your own pace. There are some great books out on repatriation and transition more generally. There's some really good workbooks on re-entry, just to journal through that experience. I've got a workshop on the TCK Training course website, which is just on repatriation specifically. It's called Returning Well, and it's just going through this experience. Once you have language, you can find the resources that are out there because you finally discover it's not just me.
Yeah, you're not an alien.
Absolutely. It took me 10 years to realize that there was a name for what I went through as a 15-year-old. And the first time I read that and I saw these things on a list, I'm like, they're describing everything I went through. And I had this relief because I thought I was just lazy and not coping, that there was something wrong with me. And there's not. When you're going through re-entry, it often feels like there is something wrong with me. And it's just transition. It's just re-entry stress, which is completely normal. And knowing that often is half the battle. But then there are supports. The other thing I would say is we use the terms red zone, green zone a lot at TCK Training to explain toxic stress and the impact it has on the body. When you go through a big move, like a location change, it is perfectly normal to be in the red zone from 2 weeks to 3 months is normal for anybody, including children, where children regress, where we have short tempers, where things are just off. If you go more than 3 months, in that red zone. If you go more than 6 months without returning to like green zone calm, that's where we recommend going and getting additional help. So seeing a therapist, seeing a counselor, getting outside help, because by that 3 to 6 month stage, you should be returning to a sense of, okay, I can cope with life, even if I still feel a little bit discombobulated, like I'm more in a calm space of body. So we've got all these kinds of resources around that to help you understand what is normal for yourself, for children, for people that you care for and work with, because it can feel a bit overwhelming in the middle of it if you don't know what normal is.
Yeah, and difficult also for executives who may feel that they should be okay. They have to manage their manager after all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What
And Craig Staughty does amazing work in this area too. His book, The Art of Coming Home, talks about re-entry and looks at it in different aspects, including what this looks like in the workplace. So that's a great place to go. He actually wrote a lovely endorsement for my book, so I was very very thankful to him for that. But he's done some really good work around
what's the name of your
both
book?
culture shock and re-entry. Oh, my book's Misunderstood: The Impact of Growing Up Overseas in the 21st Century.
That's fantastic. Well, I hope everybody who's watching heads straight for your website to get some more tips and workshops, and to find out how they can even get help wherever they are in their company or whether they're international school. That's fantastic. It's been very positive. It's great to know that there is help out there these days that wasn't there when I was 16 as well, and when you were 15.
I know, me too. Yeah.
Yeah, even in the French world, there's starting to be a lot more help available. There's a lot less in English than in English.
Yeah. Well, and in French, Valérie Besson-Cheny is always a great place to go for. She has a book like in French for kids if you want to look at moving stress around that. She does great education support as well.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thanks so much, Tanya, for explaining how stress can be avoided and minimized when you move abroad, and to help people understand if they're TCK or not. I hope that's going to be a factor, like a click turn on in their heads for them. So good to know that there's resources there for you, for people. And so if you're watching this and you've been going through this stressful experience yourself and you haven't really understand it, really encourage you to contact Tanya and her team so that you can get the help, or just talk things through to find out where you're at. And if the stress is becoming a really difficult thing with your workplace, of course, you can contact myself to help you deal with stress in the workplace and avoid it becoming a point of exhaustion, which can be done, which is really, really positive. So thank you very much for watching this video, and we both hope it's been fantastically helpful to you, and we look forward to hearing from you in the comments. Bye for now.
Bye.